Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus. As always, I am the death metal guy.
And I'm the black metal guy. And we are here for a special episode of Terminus with Serpent Column, who is just about to release his new third full-length, Kathodos. So, Serpent Column, what's that name mean?
Kathodos can mean descent, return, cycle, or reoccurrence.
And it falls as the third in this series of full lengths that have previously each had EPs between them. First Invicta, in between Ornuthi Thalassa and Mirror in Darkness, and then Endless Detainments following up on Mirror in Darkness. So, and I think there's been intimations before in previous interviews about this forming a 3-part full-length EP cycle. So, is this are we in fact nearing the end of the cycle then?
When this record was being written, it wasn't intended like that. But I think after completing its follow-up this summer, it feels like a natural boundary.
Cool. So this leads into a final EP.
It does.
Okay.
So is this EP that follows this new record, you talk about it being the end of a cycle. What does that mean in terms of Serpent Column as a whole? Is that a break point for reorientation, or is it a period and we're starting something fully new after this?
Presently, it's uncertain. There are other works that are being generated. It's just unknown whether they'll be brought to completion, which ones will be brought to completion.
Okay.
So, I guess we want to start off by giving our listeners something to hear from this new record and giving us a basis for a conversation. We've prearranged to listen to the track Offering of Tongues. This comes off the back end of the album. You have anything you want to share about that before we lead into it, or should we just go?
Let's just go into it.
Okay, so once again, what you just heard was Offering of Tongues off the new Serpent Column record, Kathodos. And so, Serpent Column, what made you choose that song to premiere here? Is it particularly representative of the album? Is it a favorite of yours? Or what was the selection process like?
It's an effective representation of the album because it's the album at its climax. And when you select a track, you're kind of consciously selecting it as attention grabbing, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of an unfortunate byproduct of just living alongside streaming platforms where everything is pre-selected. I mean, you would hope that your listeners would listen to everything front to back, but if you can select the best 2 tracks, Dereliction, Offering of Tongues.
Okay. So you're at least I gather from what you're saying, you're very invested in the idea of the album as a whole being a curated experience to be consumed as a whole. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And do you think does this apply to all of your work, or is this a particular note for Kathodos? And
It applies to all of my work. Certainly, you can pick outstanding single songs here or there. People tended to focus on Mid of the Palace with the first record. People tended to focus on Promise of the Palace with Mirror and Darkness and Anthroplasm. The opening track to Endless Attainment. And that's because they're attention grabbing tracks. Was that intended? I think with Mirror and Darkness and Endless Attainment, for sure. It's kind of regrettable, and I think I felt that regret when I was writing Kathodos, and I especially feel it after having kind of put this cycle to bed.
well, expand on that. What do you mean by regret? The idea of sort of indulging this modern attention span, or
Absolutely. I think part of me says that it was an essential compromise, and part of me says that it's just, what was erected on Ornithutha Thalassa just being worked out in practice. I think at the end of the day, I don't regret it, but that's just kind of me right now looking back at the cycle as a whole.
I understand. So
Those big tracks come very relatively early in both of those records, and Offering of Tongues is from the back end.
Yes.
Yeah.
So does that mean there's more of an effort on Kathodos to construct a sort of, as weird as it is to say this, a more traditional narrative arc with this record?
It's pretty much the same arc as Mirror and Darkness, if you
Okay.
listen closely. There are big differences here and there. It certainly closes on a different note.
Certainly.
Absolutely.
And so this idea of creating these arcs, does that tie into the idea of the album being a complete work to be absorbed in a single shot?
Yes, I mean it's good poetry. It's like any good poetry or cinema, right? It's kind of the condensed structure of an experience.
Okay. You've been talking a little bit about poetry and cinema, and that's interesting to me. Would you say that other forms of art outside of music are really crucial to the way Serpent Column develops its ideas?
Absolutely, I think more so in the past than for this record. This record, it's still an enigma to me where it came from.
Enigmatic in the sense of the compositional does that have something to do with the compositional process?
Can you clarify?
Yeah, there's a pretty liquid feeling to a lot of the riffs on this record and to the way it develops. If you find the inspiration going into this kind of enigmatic, does that correspond in any way to the composition process? How was writing this record different from previous records?
This record was certainly written more naturally. I think other listeners have commented on that as well. I would rather not get too much into the nitty gritty details because that kind of I don't know if that would add to the experience for most listeners. It might actually be to his detriment.
I understand.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of that, not to find an end run around that. To the detriment, do you mean that understanding too much about the mechanical processes detracts from the art?
It depends on what sort of art it is, I think. Absolutely. I think I'm still kind of torn about how much I want to let on. I'm still kind of torn about that. For me, has it added something to the experience when I've learned more about, let's say, when I've read interviews by Decibel and Mega, especially the most recent interviews where, he says, oh yeah, everything was recorded on, the same unplugged Gibson guitar. Did that necessarily add something for me? Sure. Did it answer questions that necessarily needed to be answered? No. I think I had already played out years before in my head how it was written, and having it open to being determined actually was a very powerful catalyst for me as an artist, because as it turns out, the way it was determined was completely different from how I had imagined. And and I kind of, how I had imagined it kind of became my blueprint.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
So you just said there was a productive mistranslation.
Absolutely. Yeah. That was kind of that was I think the function of how long they remained silent for that entire, decade and a half long period. I think it was very conscious. I think at this point, because they don't really, that cycle is over. They've kind of consciously alienated themselves from, mainstream media outlets, in music. They can afford to do that.
So he sort of sat back and waited to see how the influence was taken up.
That's what I imagine. Yeah. But that's what it did for me, and I think I'm still deciding: is this the point at which I want to disclose, or do I not want to disclose? I don't know. I don't know if it behooves me yet.
I understand.
So that reflects maybe a different idea of what it means to develop a style than a lot of people in the extreme metal world are familiar with. As in, you're saying that you went to a great length to try to figure out how these DSO albums as a whole were composed.
Sure.
And that was productive for you because you misunderstood it creatively. So are you thinking of when normally often we think of building a style as imitating a certain kind of riff or feeling or impulse, but you're interested in that holistic process.
Yeah. I think what I would say is it's very useful for somebody who wants to recreate their own mountain to not really know about geology, or only to know about geological processes only insofar as it's important.
Okay, I think I get where you're.
Yeah.
I think I get where you're getting at, and I think this is sort of we're talking in an abstract sense about a big question that we kind of talk about on the show a lot, and I'm interested to get your take on it, which is, and it doesn't have to be either or. Do you see the creation of art as a fundamentally, and excuse my wording, mystic process, or kind of spiritual process, or is it more physical and concrete?
I'm not sure if this is going to make too much sense, but if God exists, I think that he's blind to his own creation, and I think that's how a lot of artists work.
Okay. So there's not a great sort of traditionally imagistic way to put this, but are you saying that there is a quality inherent to this wall between the creator and the created, where there is perhaps some unknown process of translation in the act of creation that's important to it?
Can you maybe break it down a little simpler?
Well, because you were suggesting the idea of, God, or, God as a stand-in, in this case, for the artist, being blind to his own creation. Do you feel that that blindness is what can give the creation its outsized power? The fact that it arises perhaps from nothing, even if there is a creator behind it?
I think the answer to that is probably one of the greatest mysteries of the phenomenon of life. The
Fair
phenomenon
enough.
of life and the phenomenon of being.
Yeah, no, it's definitely in realms of abstraction I rarely get into, but
Yeah.
no, I think I
So
understand.
you're saying that it runs out ahead in excess of your intentions and plans, even if you had them or were willing to articulate them to yourself.
I would agree with that.
Well, yeah, to use a very goofy reference or metaphor, Stephen King at one point was talking about the process of writing. Yeah, Stephen King reference in the Serpent Column interview.
That's Stephen King's cool. He has a good life. Would that we were all Stephen King.
Exactly. Well, he was talking about in On Writing the idea of creation as not the artist constructing something, but rather the artist sort of excavating an idea that already exists in the aether, so to speak, which is something that I've identified with pretty strongly over the years, and I feel like you're talking about something similar in a way where the process is not ego-driven, it is not about the self, it is about unearthing an existing idea and trying not to interfere with it. Would that be accurate?
I couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah, and I think if I were to say much more on it, I would just draw too much attention to myself.
Oh, that's fair. So it seems to me like what you're saying is that it goes beyond mere blindness of the creator to his creation. It's about deliberately excising the creator from the equation. Is this something important to you? Is the division of the personal from the art, that cleaving, something that's important to the way you write music?
I think it's important for musicians now, and I think at the beginning of this project it was much more important because it was a reaction against contemporary art. I think part of my concerns is especially as of late, is how much have I actually just become what I had reacted against, and how okay am I with that?
Well, let's.
So what you're reacting against in contemporary art is this sort of cult of self-expression.
With Ornuthi Thalasso, oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, back then.
And for our listeners, if you haven't heard it, Ornuthi has this kind of monumental, distant feel to it.
It has a rigorous quality to it.
Yeah, very carefully structured. Feels like a set of architectural pieces set in place.
Mm-hmm. Well, but let's explore. You said you're afraid of sort of becoming what you were reacting against. Could you elaborate on that? I mean, in what way do you think that you've come more in contact with that sphere of the world, so to speak?
Part of my regrets now are looking back when I released Mirror in Darkness. It was meant to be extremely loud. It was meant to be listened to on monitors. It still had that kind of... it was still a contained experience, front to back.
But how does that quality reflect sort of moving towards this thing you resented about modern art?
So if Ornuthi had in it this very deliberate sort of distance that was a reaction against sort of expressiveness in modern art, and then you have Mirror in Darkness kind of I think you You seem to be on your way to saying something about how Mirror and Darkness kind of slips more into the kinds of listening that are prevalent today.
Yeah,
And possibly into that kind of expression.
Yeah, which I figured it was inevitable, and if it was inevitable, then so what? But it's not something that I want to dwell on. I don't want to make records like that again. Absolutely not.
Well, what kind of records do you want to make now?
As I said earlier, I have a few ideas for the direction of the project in the future, if it actually does have a future. One that I'm toying with at the moment is, revisiting Ornithy Thalassa and what gave birth to that. It's a possibility. I mean, that's something that I think could be accomplished over a longer time span than I had allowed it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Because it took, 2 or 3 years to make that record. That's one contender.
Mm-hmm.
So what you'd be interested in returning to, is it something about the method of composition that went into Ornuthy, or the overall aesthetic?
The method of composition, the elongated time span of how long it took to gestate everything that went into that. That's one contender.
Well, that is interesting because you've released material at a pretty steady and I'd say pretty fast pace. So, are you saying that's something you'd like to slow down in the future?
At the moment, yes.
Ornuthy kind of gave you a wellspring to continue drawing on for this more rapid set of releases, right?
Yeah. I would agree, yeah.
There's this stock of motifs and themes you created there that you've drawn on over the course of this. Are you interested in, going back to the well and developing new motifs? Is that a possibility? Is that
it's
a
a
bad
possibility.
question?
It's a distinct possibility if it is afforded to the project. Because everything works within certain constraints. It can't be determined at this point.
So you're still trying to figure out or taking your time to figure out how the thing looks.
Right, and I'm still going through I'm still at the point where I'm determining what was regrettable, what was actually a triumph. It takes time.
Well, you had mentioned everything operating within constraints. What constraints does Serpent Column operate under?
The constraints imposed upon someone living in a contemporary industrialized society who has to generate an income, abide by most of the laws, so on.
So just the sort of prosaic ennui of modern existence.
How do you mean?
Just the sort of repetitive and consuming yet meaningless nature of modern Western society.
No, it just requires energy. It puts demands on an individual's energy that in different configurations across time and geography were not necessarily universally imposed upon artists unless they're institutionalized or otherwise unproductively insane.
Is this a fancy way of saying that Serpent Column works under the constraint of having a day job?
I can't comment on that.
All right.
Fair enough.
You can put that in the interview, but I can't comment on that.
Well,
no,
fine.
I understood.
Yeah.
It's So you talked about what is regrettable and what might be a triumph. Mirror and Darkness ends on a mood of triumph. There's this kind of lodophagia leads into this total breakthrough. On this record, this last track, Offering of Tongues kind of gestures in that direction. There's this huge heavy metal riff. And then the record ends in a very different way. How did you... Well, not how did you, because that's not the right answer. Or that's not the right question.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
If as I said earlier, one good way to think of it is as if it were the structure of an experience. No two experiences are irreducible in any way. So, making a record that resolves the same way is out of the question. Making a record that has the same textures, same timbres, everything, it's out of the question.
So we've spoken about going back to our conversation about arcs and the idea of the album being a narrative experience. You've also described this set of releases, including the upcoming EP, as a cycle unto itself. So is there a greater sort of meta-narrative being played out across all those releases?
A cycle unto itself. How do you mean?
Oh, you referred to the upcoming EP as, closing the chapter and ending this cycle. So is there a greater narrative across the breadth of those records?
Because my work is determinable but indeterminate, it's difficult to talk about. It's really difficult to talk about. Again, because I don't want to lit on, necessarily the personal things that happen with us. It was certainly influential, but is it meta-artistic? Absolutely.
So by determinable but indeterminate, that's kind of that's like technical philosophical language, right?
It doesn't have to be.
Sure. Okay, but let's let's start in with determinable for who or by who or by what?
Isn't that what the world is like at its most basic?
Maybe. So maybe let's back that up. What do you mean, not necessarily in a technical sense, what do you mean by determine?
Interpreted, closed, laid bare, something that has been developed.
So to try and translate in my dumb guy speak, are you basically saying that the determinable but not determinate, you're part of the process as an individual of revealing this creation, but you don't determine its essential nature. You're merely part of bringing it out and presenting it and, lighting it rather than constructing it.
Then just closing off an interpretation. Absolutely. Absolutely. It would do no service to my listeners. It would do no service to the mission behind the project. It would do no service to the world if I did that.
So do you see the artistic process as fundamentally, I don't want to use the word contributing, but being for the world to, I don't know if even affect change, but to kind of elucidate a certain truth as you understand it?
Not a truth. Not a truth. The ability to experience the world more fully fleshed out, infinitely replenishable.
So
that's a core, very core impetus behind the whole reason for this project.
So in that regard, this is an idea that I've been kind of dwelling on lately. Is that process of expansion, in a way, is that additive or subtractive? Is it about providing a methodology through which to think and to perceive, or is it a subtractive process by removing what we see as fake or illegitimate about the way we understand the world now?
I think you have to do both. For me, you saw this project kind of just emerge with Ornuthi Telos. You didn't see what happened in the 3 years that led up to that.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't. I've alluded to it, but I'm not going to. Again, it wouldn't behoove my listeners. It wouldn't behoove the project if I were to just tell you how to back engineer it.
So some of the... Oh wait, Death Metal Guy, were you asking about back engineering the project, or were you asking more about the kind of... If the idea of the project is to reveal this infinitely replenished existence, whether that's about adding...
The possibility for an infinitely replenishable existence, even in modernity. Even in late modernity.
Yeah, no, I was definitely asking in a more spiritual sense.
Yeah.
Is this an additive or a subtractive process? Which I understand is like some pet idea that I'm fixated on, but hopefully I'm explaining it.
No, I think that's actually a good phrase.
Because I guess to kind of step ahead of myself, I feel like what you're describing is additive, whereas many other, heavy metal bands are fundamentally subtractive. They're about removing veils and kind of laying bare reality, whereas you are talking about sort of constructing, in a sense, an epistemology of modern full existence, as full as it can be in modern society.
I would like to show people a few waystones on the way. Absolutely.
Okay, I understand.
Not like I am, some sort of sage, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, it's in my personal life, or the personal life of anybody involved in this project. But is there something that back engineering being in time while you read it does to a person? Absolutely. I mean, it builds character in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Recreating how any work of art that you are just purely enamored with was made. That's again that's a kind of that's a thing that it's so alien to the experience of daily life in this civilization, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the experience of just coming up as a child into this civilization. You don't really get it from too many sources. Do you get it from religion? You can. Does religion serve the same function that it did in, let's say, 12th century in Western Europe? No.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's not edifying, right? Is there really anything that's edifying now? Well, black metal, honestly. I think black metal, whatever you can get your hands on that a university education could provide to you, and as much free time as you possibly can.
So it suggests to me that in obviously very simplified terms, one of the things you're talking about is the idea of art being something to be revered and appreciated on a very foundational level rather than a product to be consumed as entertainment.
It ought to be. Well, things can be appreciated as entertaining, and certainly, Serpent Column has a lot of entertainment value. And you can just let it operate on that level alone.
Mm-hmm.
But it's meant to be.
If you choose to head down the path that it calls you towards, you can.
Mm-hmm.
You have everything you need.
Certainly, it sounds like you're talking about a different kind of reverence from what people might ordinarily associate with the word, right? The like let's say when we talk about revering a piece of art, I think I get what the death metal guy was getting at for sure. But when we talk about revering a piece of art, people might have this connotation of admiring the great work of genius and kind of holding it at a distance and sort of a kind of distant worship, let's say, the reverence for the Michelangelo statue or whatever, right? And this isn't that.
Right. One of the worst films I've ever seen, on a semi-related note, was there's a rotoscoped biopic of Van Gogh. Absolutely terrible. Is look at this poor. This is why it's absolutely essential for someone to just elide themselves from their work, especially in black metal, right?
I think one of the things that you're getting at is the shift over time, especially with kind of the advent of, I would probably say, like, industrial culture, of the reverence being displaced from the art to the artist, it becoming more a matter of hero worship, is sort of like ego-driven exercise and identifying with a person rather than the piece standing on its own to communicate something meaningful.
I think so, yeah. And I think identifying with somebody helps if you are trying to get there, absolutely. And if it's a place worth, if it's a place that is actually worth getting to. It depends on the listener and their goals, really.
Mm-hmm.
And identifying with the artist is different from the kind of biographical fetishism for the great man of genius that the death metal guy was talking about, or that you were meant with Van Gogh.
Absolutely. I mean, this type of art is not necessarily something that you see. It's something that most people take with them to an institution. It's something that if you lit it, if you don't have the right teachers, and the circumstances just aren't right, and the course of events are unfortunate, you can lead to you just being unproductively insane.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying
it's always the risk.
The call-in to make this kind of art, or hearing the call-in?
The calling just to... Yeah, to play this role.
And do you feel that the sort of unproductive insanity is the sort of the frustrated creative impulse coming home to roost?
I think it's the unfortunate, the unfortunate confluence of circumstances. Like, think of before modern industrialized cities were developed, what we call clinically schizophrenia was not pathological, right? In people's, in people's endemic environments, right? So, as soon as you take these people, you throw them inside modern industrialized cities,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes pathological. There's suddenly, any sort of rule book, any sort of, shamanic initiation process, whatever the tradition is,
Yeah.
it's gone. It's gone, and
They go from someone with a special kind of knowledge. Right, schizophrenia is about extreme sensitivity to stimuli. And,
right.
Yeah, we'll say whatever you're going to say.
Literally, your sensory gating is lowered. Like your ability to filter out information from your senses is lowered, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like
It all makes a claim on you, or has meaning.
it can. Oh, it can.
Or it can.
It's a tool. It's a powerful tool, right? It just has no place in. It doesn't have a place in our civilization, or if it does,
Right,
it has a very, very limited place. And well, it's because, I mean, I have various opinions as to why.
So
sorry.
Continue.
No, go ahead.
Well, that's an interesting, and that's actually, so this is, there's a whole strain of thought about this, right? Which is something like, sort of industrial capitalism or modernity or urbanization creates schizophrenia, right? That's one strain of thought. And you're actually taking it slightly differently. You're saying schizophrenia is at least just one version of hearing the spirits, and it's when you put that in a when you put that ability to see a meaning-infused world in a system that works by bombarding everyone with symbols, that's when you get pathology.
Absolutely. Now, are there exceptions to the rule? Of course. And is it? Yeah, I'm going to leave it off on that.
Well, specifically because there's, in modern society, no place for anything that exists outside the bounds of immediate categorization and commodification.
Right.
It can't function within an industrialized system. It is a gear that does not have use to the watch, so it needs to be eliminated.
I mean, one thing that I've used in my work is part of the story of Enkidu in Gilgamesh. I don't think I've actually ever talked about this. What happens to Gilgamesh when he is taken into right? Is that the city?